maternal grandparents' side were from East Anglia. The tradition was mostly that many of the men in the Crowfoot family had become doctors. Often the younger men in the families would go into the church. And this was certainly true of her paternal grandfather, as you see there, named as the Chancellor of Lincoln Cathedral, which he became in later life. And he married the woman in the centre there, and they were the Crowfoots that moved forward, and John Winter Crowfoot, who's in the centre bottom there, who's Dorothy's father, was born in 1873, and he was following his father's footsteps. He went to Oxford. He got a first in Greats, both of them very well educated, and a lot of the interest that they had jointly was in archaeology, antiquities, and there were things around the house that influenced the young John at the time. Anyway, he had taken this first-class degree and was lucky enough to get a scholarship, which allowed him to travel. So he traveled into the Middle East in various areas. I can't remember, 2 years or something. And he came back and he became a lecturer at Birmingham University. But that was less than interesting to him. He didn't want to become a sort of card-carrying academic, I think, at that time. And he had the opportunity at the beginning of the 20th century to go to the Middle East, in Sudan. He was variously in Sudan, in Egypt, and he had the assistant director of education's post to begin with, as I say, just at the turn of the century. Subsequently, he became the director of education, but he had met, prior to this journey, he'd met Molly Hood, and she's the lady at the top, your top right, and she came from sort of country squire's family, lived in Lincolnshire, Nettleham Hall, and she was the eldest of 6. There were two girls and 4 boys. And Molly had met John at a ball in Lincoln, apparently. And they kept in touch, but John didn't seem to be in any hurry to do anything about it and get married. But nonetheless, Molly did slightly pursue it, perhaps, by keeping in touch with him. But she had wanted to go to university, possibly wanted to be a doctor, but her mother didn't encourage this. She didn't want to, Molly to go to one of these new colleges set up for women specifically in Oxford. And she was persuaded to do a course in midwifery in London, which she did. She also was very interested in history and archaeology, in antiquities. She was also very interested in, arts and other matters. In fact, the children of Nettleham Hall were schooled at home, and she and her sister went to finishing school, as we would have called it then, in Paris. Anyway, so Molly was well talented in various areas, but she took the midwifery course in London, and she sort of said to John, well, I'm thinking of going abroad and doing good things and working to help women who don't want to see male doctors maybe in the Middle East, and I can do things to help them. Anyway, that seemed to have sparked off a good idea in John, and they got married in 1909. And that was at Nettleham Hall, where her family home. So a year later, Dorothy was born. 2 years later, her sister Joan was born. Another 2 years later, sister Elizabeth was born. And if I move on from that little bit of history there, here we have some pictures here. And during this time, John was still continuing his work as director of education. He was doing really good things with setting up schools, trying to set up schools for girls. She was doing good things with trying to get the women in the area interested in other things. She taught drawing, she taught needlework, she did, helpful things to get the women involved in the region. And you can see there some rather nice old photographs. Top left is Molly with Dorothy. And then you see on the top, on the right-hand side, there you see the nurse Katie with the 3 elder daughters. And in fact, it was by chance that Molly had met Katie and persuaded her to, I think she may have been a child's nurse, but anyway, she was persuaded to join the family. And so when they went back to England, Katie went with them. Now, Molly had decided that, because by now the war had started, that the children should be taken home. They should not be in in the Middle East. So they were taken back to stay near their grandparents, parents who'd retired to near Worthing, and Katie was looking after them. So there they were at an early age, and Dorothy was the eldest, taking up a residence away from their parents. It wasn't unusual for people who were working for the war effort to have their children lodged somewhere else, but perhaps it was unusual for them to be on their own for such a long time. And I think Molly didn't come back more than a few times in those 4 years, and Katie and the grandparents were looking after them. So you can begin to see how Dorothy, as the eldest, becomes really quite mature for her years. She's responsible. She takes care of the other girls. She has to make decisions. She has to do things for the family that perhaps a normal 6, 7, 8, 9-year-old wouldn't have actually had to do. So some of her character, of course, is already formed by the time we move on in the story. And the lower left-hand side picture there, you can see that all 4 girls are now together, because when Molly did come back at the end of the war in 1918, she had a new daughter, Diane. So there's the 4 of them gathered in that picture there. Now, the schooling that they had, the 4 girls, to some extent, was at home. They had exciting things to do. They did nature by going for walks, picking flowers. They had a strong way of teaching that Molly herself had learnt by being taught at home, if you like. And so it was a bit of an unconventional schooling, but it was still educational. There did come a point where John decided that perhaps he should come home and settle the family in a more permanent residence rather than a somewhat mixed one of them moving about quite a bit. And of course, the girls did also, and Dorothy in particular, as the eldest, would often join her parents on expeditions. When she had been staying with her grandmother at some point, they had a villa in San Remo, and in fact there was an excavation of a cave, and Dorothy went into there and helped out and found all sorts of little bits and pieces. And she was, absolutely extremely careful of how she searched for these pieces in the dig, and things that she found and rescued and labelled them and looked at them. And the formal schooling I'll come to in a minute, but there's just one question as to when did Dorothy really become interested in symmetry, in patterns, and how was this sparked? There are several inferences here. As I said, she had been on a dig near the villa in San Remo, and this is a picture of a drawing that she made in her own notebook when she went on a dig much later into Jerash with her, and her father and mother were going there. And they spent about 2 months, I think, out in the wilds somewhere, living in tents and living fairly, well, not wild, but living a different life. And this is between the time when she was finishing school and going up to Somerville. And the mosaics there aren't the real ones, they're just ones I found. And if you see in the bottom right-hand corner, I've just put in again sort of patterns, symmetry, and things that came from Dorothy's later scientific life and sort of results, as we heard this morning from Mike Glaser in 1951, when so many of the crystallographic patterns that were evolving and appearing in the literature then were used in the Festival of Britain for making wallpapers, fabrics, floor coverings, and so on. So, already we've got chance in here in terms of the way John Crowfoot wanted to go back to the Middle East to follow his love of early Christian churches and excavating and researching that rather than being a lecturer in Birmingham. Chance that she found Katie in Cairo, and she needed someone to look after the girls. But of course, Dorothy had herself opportunities that you could say were chance, luck, being in the right place at the right time, but you have to grab those chances, you have to take them, and you have to have the sort of foresight, the brilliance, I suppose, to make the most of them. But moving on, as I say, John, having been a director of education in the Middle East, he felt his children should perhaps go to a local school. And before the age of 10, when he researched the area, found a home near Beccles, which was Girdleston, the old vicarage, not the old vicarage, the old house, and they settled there. And this is round about when Dorothy was 10, and she was sent to the another local small school, which was set up, Parents National Education Unit, I think, PNEU, and which meant that children could be educated somewhat better than just being looked after by a governess on the basics of education. Anyway, and while she was there, one of the things that children did was to grow crystals. She grew crystals of alum and copper sulfate. Now, how could you not like those? I mean, all of us have loved growing crystals, I'm sure, and being really excited when they appear, shiny, bright, beautiful forms, lovely colors, birefringence, whatever it is. But anyway, she is said to have remarked at the time, "I was captured by chemistry and by crystals for life." And that's a quote in various texts relating to Dorothy's early life. But the year later, she moved into the Sir John Lehman School in Beccles. And you can see that photograph there. It's mostly boys, but two of the girls, her and her friend Nora, were allowed into the class. They had a wonderful teacher, a woman called Christine, who herself had taken and unusually taken a first-class degree from Birmingham a few years before, not very long, and really encouraged those two girls. They both did extremely well, and they made real progress, as you can see from the notes there. And the comments that came out of her lower six school report, I think, are always good to read, which is the things that are remarked upon as very good, which is drawing, no doubt, having watched her mother draw flowers and draw everything for years, and she could copy her, and the scripture being excellent as well, no doubt from the learnings of her father and mother. But chemistry, well, good on the whole, so it obviously had room to get better at that point. However, by the time she took the school leaving certificate in 1927, she was top of the grouping of those taking the Oxford exams at that time, which was quite amazing. Nora had also done extremely well, but Nora had been, if you like, predetermined by her parents to go into, let's say, good housekeeping, a domestic science college, and went from there and went on to teach it, I think, which was, Dorothy found, rather sad in a way, because Nora was at least as clever, has done it well at school, enjoyed chemistry, but it was directed, as I say, to domestic science. She didn't have the freedom or the encouragement from her parents that Dorothy had from her own. And there are, again, a lot more coincidences and sort of interjections of chance and luck, if you like. But earlier on, when they'd been in the Middle East, and they were often with the parents, not just in the early years, but at other times. There was a visit, I've forgotten where they were now, Khartoum, I think, when Sir Henry Wellcome, who was busy setting up a biomedical centre, as we'd call it today, and investing there, met family, and which was, really great for them to be able to sort of talk science, Dorothy to talk science with him. And another scientist who was there as well, who became known as Uncle Joseph, had been showing the girls how to pan for gold. And they thought this was rather fun, so they tried that when they got home, or to where they were staying. And in fact, what they did was they found, or Dorothy rather, found a mineral called ilmenite, which she tried to test for, but it turned out that that contains titanium, and titanium wasn't in her either a chemistry text or wasn't in the box of tricks that she had for testing her chemicals. And Uncle Joseph gave her one of these portable boxes for analysis, which she took home with her and worked with rather at home in the attics. And it's amazing to read how she was allowed, not only by her parents, but the local chemist would supply what she needed to do these little experiments at home, which she did in the attic, but luckily didn't set anything on fire. But that was, that's a chance occurrence again of people who were to influence her. John Crowfoot also met Marjorie Fry when he was in Egypt, and you'll see where she later becomes a person who is influencing another step in Dorothy's life. And during the years at school, her mother had given to Dorothy the books written by the Braggs in 1923 and 25, I think, Nature of Things, and I forget the other title, but basically Bragg in those books in the talks had thought it would be absolutely marvelous, but as we go through, as X-ray diffraction changes, gets better, more advanced, we will be able to see atoms. And Dorothy was, again, mesmerized by the idea that we could actually see atoms. So there are all these things that are sort of coming together in terms of focusing her scientific direction. But what I really wanted to say alongside all of this was the fact that she had these other influences on her life which were way outside just a one-track science sort of education. She was a huge, well, her mother had been very interested in social, had a social conscience, was social reform. Her mother, very sadly, had lost all four brothers in the First War or immediately afterwards as consequences of something that happened to them in the war. So that was a huge shock for the family, and those, I mean, inevitably, an influence on Dorothy as well. Her mother became active in League of Nations at that time and took Dorothy to a meeting a little bit later on. She was a bit older. But nonetheless, these are all things that will have made Dorothy really, peace-loving, believed in settling disputes by dialogue and not by fighting or by crazy arguments. And in a way, she was political, but quietly, not in the way that we've heard of some of the great men scientists who've gone into science policy, but we need all sorts. So, moving on from there. Sorry. Top left would be Dorothy around about the time she went up to Somerville. And getting into Somerville, again, a series of chance encounters. By then, Marjorie Fry, who herself had been to Somerville, qualified and went on and came back as a tutor. She was by then the principal of the college. And Dorothy was admitted, but when she went for the exams in the first place, she didn't have all the right subjects. She was short of mathematics and short of another science, and she was tutored to help her get actually the right place at Somerville, which she did, and she went up in 1928. There are pictures there of Thomas and Dorothy later, but so she worked in the chemistry department, her first degree in chemistry, and her, what we would call Part 2 project, was working with Tiny Powell on crystallography, which she really enjoyed. But when it came to the question of moving on to a PhD, again, question of people they knew and influences, it had been suggested that perhaps this relatively young chap in Cambridge, Bernal, would be a good place for her to go and join the crystallography groups. If I've got time, Peter, I will just read this because I think it's just lovely. It's a letter that she wrote to her parents when the question of PhDs came up. My dearest Mummy and Daddy, a few days ago, Dr. Joseph wrote to me that he had asked Professor Larry about the possibility of my doing X-ray work on crystals and whether it was a good thing. And all that sounded very nice, really excellent just then, since the X-ray work would be useful in absolutely everything I decided to do afterwards. Yet if I did not do it now, I probably should not have the chance again. But at the moment, I'm feeling quite appalled at the prospect. There will be such a fearful lot of work and mathematics involved, and I was just beginning to rejoice so much in the idea of a nice, quiet, organic research that would involve no brain work whatever. As it is, it will be poor brain work and mosaics all over again. I was just shivering in my shoes, terribly afraid I really am trying to force too much on one poor little brain that is non-existent already. It's one thing to be able to appreciate structures that other people have worked out for crystals, quite another to be able to work them out for yourself. Of course, if I can do it, it would be rather priceless. Typical Dorothy, if anybody knew her. So there is Dorothy moving over to Cambridge to work with Bernal, PhD, and she this is where she really moved into the protein field. She'd been working on inorganic structures in Oxford, and there's some wonderful pieces of literature left where she worked out structures often by trial and error methods. But she joined Bernal, and those are the pictures in the bottom left there, and we've heard already about the pepsin crystals that came from Svedberg in Sweden, and how they discovered that by keeping them wet, they could get diffraction spots, whereas if they let them dry in the atmosphere, as one might have done with other crystals, they didn't diffract at all. So that's where the protein work for so many people started in a way. And we've heard of Helen McGaw's influence in this as well. But shortly after she had arrived in Cambridge, Somerville offered her basically a job, but it wasn't really a job, a fellowship back at Oxford for 2 years. And it was really difficult for her because she was really enjoying Cambridge. She was really enjoying Bernal. They were great friends. Someone could say greater. But she had the opportunity to, well, the governing body eventually decided that they didn't really want to let Dorothy go. And so she was offered of this 2-year fellowship to stay 1 more year in Cambridge and then 1 year back in Oxford. And that 1 year back in Oxford, she would be exempt from teaching. It all sounded super. So she went ahead with all this and she went back to Oxford. And there she stayed for the rest of her working life. And as I say, another coincidence, apart from the opportunity to be back in Oxford where she wanted to be in Children's College eventually, another coincidence was when she was working, she wanted a more powerful source to take some crystals. And she persuaded Bragg to let her go and use his more powerful kit at the Royal Institution. And she stayed up there for the week. And then when she was staying with Marjorie, she wasn't. Staying with Marjorie Fry. And Marjorie had guests that evening, one of whom was Thomas Hodgkin. And so these 2 young people spent quite a lot of the time talking about life in general, found they had things in common. And you can see pictures there of Thomas when he was much younger and more, obviously charming. Anyway, nothing more happened then. But later, just even more a chance meeting when Thomas had been disappointed in what he was doing after university. And he'd been, probably, possibly heavily drinking and smoking, wasn't quite worked out what he wanted to do in his life, when by chance, Dorothy, it sounds as if he came around one corner, she came around another corner. They met, they bumped into each other, they got together, and then they were madly in love, and they were a couple. This was in the early part of 1937. They decided to marry fairly quickly. The parents were asked and approved, and they were married in December 1937. And they were married from the house in Gedleston near Beccles in Norfolk. Now, a year later, as we know, the first child arrived, and that's Luke. And so you can see Thomas with the baby, and then there's a later picture as Elizabeth was the next child to arrive. She's in the lower picture there in the centre. I'm sorry I haven't got a picture of Toby, the youngest, who arrived a year or two after that. Now, this slide is probably the only one that comes close to having any structures on it, but it's a picture of Dorothy, by now well settled into Somerville. And I should just digress to say that when she had her fellowship at Somerville, which I mentioned she went back to after Cambridge, when she married, it was the tradition that the women would resign their fellowship. So she did, but she was immediately reappointed. That necessarily didn't have to happen, but it did. And then there was more problems, of course, when she had her first baby, because she was supposed to stop again, but she didn't want to. And she didn't have to, as it happened, because she was lucky to have help with the children, help in the house. And also she was able to, or some of it were able to help her. And I think she was the first female fellow who fell pregnant and who got maternity leave and maternity pay, more to the point. So that's an interesting time, and it doesn't seem possible or sensible looking back, but that's how it was. So the chemical crystallography lab in 1951 is the only picture I've got of that time of where she was working. You can see Dorothy pretty much in the center, only it's Tiny Powell who's in the center. He was her supervisor when she was an undergraduate. They got on okay, but you wouldn't say they were bosom pals. There's some sort of, well, they got on fine. And they were both there when I was there. And to Dorothy's right-hand side, no, yes, no, I'm left and right, I can't do it this way. Anyway, that's Frank Welch, who was a technician who was wonderful, did all sorts of things. And I discovered he was, when Dorothy's arthritis got worse, he was able to make a sort of a widget that would enable her to do things with the X-ray set that she otherwise couldn't have managed to do with her disabled hands. And you see the bottom right-hand side is the drawing made by Henry Moore of Dorothy's badly arthritic hands. Very, very sadly, she developed rheumatoid arthritis when she was only 28. And this was with her and didn't get any better for the rest of her life. But it didn't stop her doing things. And these are other things. There's a long, part of her character, its focus, its determination. It's not to give up. It's you find a hard problem and you just keep going till you crack it. You don't give up just because it's a bit harder. And so many would have not been able to carry on the way she did with her rather disabled hands. But she didn't let it get in the way, and she didn't moan. She really didn't make a fuss about it at all. But in the period I put then, it's about 1951, the photograph. But it was in this time that so much was going on exciting in her life in science. If you remember, she'd taken the first photographs of insulin, wet ones, of course, when she went back to Oxford at the end of 1934, and she was just so excited that she got diffraction spots. But it was a huge problem. There was no way they could solve it at that time, but it wouldn't be, she knew that at some point protein structures would be solved by the diffraction methods. So there's some pictures there that you just to focus your ideas on insulin. Having started in 1934, I believe that note that says insulin solved, Tom will remember, is 1969, and Tom certainly went to the meeting in the States to announce the structure solved at the Stony Brook meeting. There's a film at the bottom, just because I like those old-fashioned photographs, and it's one from Dorothy's lab, and I forget the year. And on the other side, when she was already working by 51 on vitamin B12 structure. Lester Smith had been instrumental in getting her those crystals, and that really one of the exciting things, of course, apart from the fact it was a big molecule to attempt, was that it had a metal atom in the middle, a cobalt atom in the middle. It's ringed there, due to, I think, yes, a light ring in the cobalt, which was really quite exciting to find a biological molecule with that cobalt already there, which helped, of course, to phase the structure. But it was still a big, big molecule, and very challenging. The penicillin structure, which is also very famous, came about during the early part of the Second World War. They couldn't say anything about what they'd found until the war was over, but of course it was already very, very important for saving people dying in the war at the front. I mean, there's a whole 1 or 2 lectures on penicillin on your own if you stop to talk about it. But that was published, that structure there was published in 1949. I believe that picture of Dorothy is probably much later and possibly at the time she won the Nobel Prize. And the other pictures just below the vitamin B12 is to point out that one of the people working with her, Jenny Pickworth, in Oxford on that structure, and you can see some of the perspex plates with the electron density drawn on them, became Jenny Glusker when she met Don in the States, and is still a very, very great friend and supporter of Dorothy and her work. So that's the end of my little story, and I probably haven't emphasized enough how much she was peace-loving, how much she cared about people, how she was a sort of gentle way of dealing with problems. She became the Chancellor at Bristol University when I went back there after Oxford, and she would stand her ground, and people thought, well, there's a little frail old lady there, and she had to have the She took over from Winston Churchill, and you can imagine he had these amazingly large robes, which had to be slightly taken down for Dorothy. But she wouldn't just wander in as a figurehead. She would stand her ground. If there was something to be argued with about the university administration, she would do it in her nice, quiet, gentle way that Dorothy had. Impressive. But as I say, this is really just an introduction of how possibly she became the person she did. Who can tell? But it's a really lovely story. And as I say, thanks to Georgina for her wonderful biography. The books I refer to there, the collected works, there are 3 large volumes, and it was published by the Indian Academy of Sciences, and I still have some of those books if anybody wants any. They're big. So, and there's the collected people at that meeting launched just after she died 2 years later. And sadly, some of the people in that picture, including, we've just heard about David Phillips, Louise Johnson, Siv Ramasation and Guy Dodson. Jenny Glusker is there and still with us. So, and I will just thank you for your attention and leave you with those, I say, acknowledgements. It's mostly Hodgkin family, of course, and I thank them seriously for the time I've had with them. I still see Lizzie a lot, great friend. And the book I was mentioned earlier, From Atoms to Patterns, Georgina's book's in the middle. Dorothy's biography from the Royal Society is there, and so on. So thank you.
Yeah, wonderful talk. Now we just have time just for a couple of, just really do have to be quick. Just a couple of quick questions. Anybody for quick questions? Anybody for any questions? No questions. Tom, do you have anything to say? Okay.
I joined a little bit, well, at the end of that story in the 60s. So, but thank you very much. It was great.